Is fungus fueling your eczema? This is really an interesting concept to understand if you have eczema, if you have a child with eczema, if you have eczema, because sometimes we're not just dealing with eczema, which is inflammation in the skin. We're dealing with a root cause of fungus actually causing that inflammation. And you can use as many creams as you would like that lower the inflammation. And yes, you might be able to lower that inflammation, but you may never be able to get rid of it because you're not dealing with the root problem. And I find fungus, in a lot of my patients, I actually would say this was a big problem for me. So I would say this is one of my biggest root causes. When I had eczema was fungus, and it was a yeast that was growing both in my gut and on my skin. And we're going to talk about that today. And so I'm joined by Tori, who is a clean body practitioner and eczema expert. And together, Tori and I make up the Clean Body team. So, Tori, welcome. And I'd love to also hear what your experience is with fungus and eczema. So, we're going to talk about it today. Thank you for joining me.
Of course.
All right. So, let's just talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So, we're going to talk about yeast overgrowth. What are the symptoms of that? What do you need to look out for? How does yeast affect that skin externally? What does it look like? So, how can you identify maybe that you have a yeast overgrowth? How does gut yeast influence inflammation and immunity? And what is the impact of mold exposure from the environment on eczema? And how do we test for these fungal issues? And then what are some basic antifungal nutrition tips? And then we're going to also go a little bit into topicals as well. Although a lot of times it can be really helpful to work with someone to kind of choose those topicals, but we'll go into some of the basics on what you might need to think of if you think that you might have a fungal issue, okay? All right, so the types of yeast. Now, there is a type of yeast that grows on the skin mainly, and it's called Malassezia. And everyone actually has this yeast on their skin. But what happens is when the skin breaks open, and like, let's say maybe you actually even have eczema or you have a leaky barrier, that will allow Malassezia to grow a little bit easier. And then we'll also talk about how oils can feed that Malassezia, but that's usually the type we'll see on the skin. And then in the gut, we often see Candida. This is a different type of yeast, and this can fuel that inflammation. And sometimes we do see Candida on the skin as well too, but more often we'll see Malassezia on the skin. And then mold can be in the environment at home, and this can really overstimulate the immune system. So all three components can actually be triggering eczema together or separately. And more often than not, I actually see all three of these together as a problem. Tori, do you see the same thing?
Absolutely. If not all three, definitely the first two, I would say. And then if you have any mold exposure, I think that's a big one that could probably be like a whole nother topic that we could really dig into, but that is absolutely a big contributor as well. And that one could even be by itself for sure.
Yep, absolutely. So on the surface of your skin, we're looking at itchy, flaky patches on the scalp, face, chest, or back. And the reason for that is because those are the oily places. And you might notice your eczema worsens when using oil-based moisturizers. You might see oozing or shiny lesions, greasy, scaly patches, especially in the oily zones. And we're going to break this down even further so that you can kind of identify if you might have some yeast growing on your skin. But let's kind of do an overview right now. So then inside your body, we have gas, bloating, irregular digestion, strong sugar or carb cravings. You might have brain fog, fatigue, or low energy. And then, of course, recurrent eczema. And then if you've used antibiotics or steroids, you may actually see the problem inside your body and on the surface as well. So often, if somebody takes antibiotics, they may actually have an eczema flare. And often that could actually be because yeast is now overgrowing because you have killed off some of that beneficial bacteria that was keeping that yeast down. And again, we have this yeast on our skin, but the problem is when we overgrow that yeast and then often we can actually have an inflammatory reaction to that yeast where we have an allergic reaction, and we can test for this as well. And then in the environment, if we have mold, we might see that the rash worsens when at home rather than outside. And that's kind of a big tell for that one. You might have really musty smells. Maybe there's been like a water leak or water damage that you know of in the house. If it's an older home, maybe there's been water damage that you don't even know about. Maybe there's mold in the basement. Maybe there's mold in your HVAC system. These are all places to look. And then if you have eczema along with breathing issues, headaches, or sinus congestion, that could really be another clue that maybe there's mold. And then general fatigue or brain drag, especially when you're indoors, like in your home or in your office. And again, office is another place you might want to look for mold. So, we're covering all the potential sources of fungal overload today. And so that's kind of what you want to look at on the skin, inside your body, and in your environment, and whether things change with that environment. So, as I said, Malassezia is a yeast that lives on everyone's skin, and it's usually harmless. But when somebody has kind of these leaky barrier on their skin, Malassezia can overgrow, and that can trigger itchiness, inflammation. Again, we can see on testing that you're having an allergic reaction even to this Malassezia, and especially in those oily areas. So as pictured here, you might see it on your neck, your scalp, your face, everywhere where kind of you get itchy. And then if you sweat and it gets worse, that can also be a sign of Malassezia. And over 50% of eczema patients show that sensitization to Malassezia. So they'll have that IgE reaction to Malassezia on testing. And then in head and neck eczema, up to 79% of people have that Malassezia specific IgE. So Malassezia does respond to the skin pH, to lipids, and immune barrier integrity. So if you are having that immune barrier integrity really broken because you're scratching a lot, so yes, this could start with eczema, but you scratch a lot, open up that barrier, and now Malassezia starts to grow. And then you put oils on that, on top of that. Now Malassezia is like, woo, let's have a
Yeah.
party. And then you sweat, and that feeds the Malassezia too. Okay. Now, I like to call yeast mapping on the skin. And
Mhm.
there's a picture here, if you're looking at this, where you kind of see this like irregular border. Kind of resembles continents or islands on a map. They can be slightly raised, red, tan edges, and then the central area could be a little bit clearer or a lighter center. And then there's like fine scaling. And yeast can grow in these patches, often where sebum, sweat, and moisture collect. And this can be on the nose, the eyebrows, the scalp edges, the chest folds. You might see it like around the ears as well, too. And you'll see this distribution often in oil-rich zones. That's kind of the seborrheic pattern. And this type of eczema is called seborrheic dermatitis. So you may also see it on the eyebrows as well, too. And that is a type of eczema, okay? And so you can see these maps, but you can also see a little bit of lightening of the skin. And so this is called tinea versicolor. And this is where you might see lighter areas like a map as well, where you see these kind of irregular borders and, that are kind of growing on the skin, and it's lighter in color. And then you may see fungal folliculitis as well. These are clusters of pinpoint pustules following the hair follicles, and often mapped out in patches as well. So there's different ways that the yeast can show up. And when we, are seeing our patients at Clean Body, we will help to determine what might be going on, and then that will identify what testing do we need. Okay, yeah, we do see that maybe there is a yeast presentation. Now we might need to do testing, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So, how to differentiate? If the mapping appears where there's oil and sweat and it worsens with humidity, or if everything is kind of closed up and occluded, it's likely yeast driven. If it gets worse when you sweat, absolutely. If it burns or stings more than it itches, that could also be a sign of a yeast problem. If it tends to flare quickly when you put oils or like barrier creams that feed Malassezia, then that absolutely might be a yeast problem too. Okay. So on the skin, this is what we might be wanting to look at and what you can evaluate. If you are like, I wonder if my eczema is yeast driven. Okay. And moving on to the gut, and I'll let actually Tori take this one because Tori, being someone who focuses on nutrition, sees a lot of this probably, which is Candida. That's Candida, which is a yeast that lives in the gut. So tell us a little bit about that, Tori.
Yeah, it's actually native to the gut. So everybody has some candida, but in certain situations like antibiotics or steroids, like you had mentioned before, even like high stress or a really high processed or sugary diet, we can actually get overgrowth of that candida in the gut. So even one course of antibiotics, most people don't know this, one course of antibiotics can set you up on this path. So it doesn't have to be multiple. It doesn't have to be, I had 5 courses in a year. It can be one. And research supports that. Just one course of antibiotics takes about 2 to 3 years for your microbiome just to go back to the baseline that it was at before you started those. And most people's baseline is not that good anyway. So you're really knocking it down. And so that candida will damage the gut lining, which, in our world, we call that a leaky gut. In the medical world, you probably call it intestinal permeability. So you get little holes poked in that lining. And then when you get those holes, the fragments and toxins from that candida actually make their way out into the bloodstream. And then you get an immune response. And that can be the beginning of a lot of other situations in the body. One of those things can be eczema flare-ups. And so this plays into even that malassezia on the skin because it's going to impact the external layer of the skin. It's also going to play into diet and what you eat because the more sugar and processed carbohydrates you feed, that will feed that yeast overgrowth. And it's all about making sure we get that good bacteria back in. So if you're not doing that, or we're not killing off that yeast, then we can create a bunch of problems. So I would say, in my clinical experience, this is the most common, and then the mold and the malassezia come second to this. I feel like everyone that has fungal issues, it usually starts in the gut, and then sometimes you can have additional fungal issues on top of it. But I think candida in the gut is a huge problem for eczema.
Yep, absolutely. And we also have a problem with environmental fungal overgrowth, and that could be mold, as we discussed earlier. And where I see mold is bathrooms, obviously, basements, even HVAC systems. So, this is like your heating and cooling system in your home. That's kind of the centralized place where all of this air is going to flow through. And often there can be mold growing there. And the only way to really check that is to actually have someone come to your home.
Mhm.
Um, and the mold releases these spores, these VOCs, and mycotoxins that really affect people's health. And early life exposure to visible mold is linked to atopic dermatitis. So, pregnant women as well as babies exposed to mold have been shown to have an increased risk of having atopic dermatitis or eczema. And not everyone is sensitive to mold. So we do see that there are some genetics that we can look at that indicate, okay, this person may be more susceptible to mold. So you could have like 5 people living in the same house, maybe roommates, and like 2 people have a problem and the 3 people don't have as much of an issue. And that could be because of genetics. And so some people have more mold sensitivity, and this can trigger chronic inflammation. It can suppress or overactivate that immune system and definitely worsen eczema symptoms. So it's interesting how like people can live in the same house, and
Mhm.
then some people are having all these symptoms and some people are having zero symptoms, and that's genetics. So genetics can be a part of that, and then obviously it can also be the things that you're doing in your life to create more inflammation. The more inflammation you have in your body, the more the environment is going to also affect that inflammation. Okay. So in your body is kind of where we start, but your environment is very, very important. Okay. Now, these can all overlap. So you have the external, the internal, and the environmental yeast. And if they all overlap, this is a big problem. So you're going to get, that leaky skin, you're going to get that leaky gut, and the immune system is just going to be going haywire. And each of these feeds into one another and really creating that immune cascade that equals eczema. Okay. So when we say like, eczema isn't really a skin problem. This is a problem that is going deeper in the system. Something is triggering a lot of inflammation. This is a big topic. Fungus, exposures, and then also fungal overgrowth in our bodies. Somebody is asking, will this be saved to review later? This is actually going to be released as a podcast next week. I'm also going to post the replay of this live on my story. So check out my story later today, and then you could watch this. But it will also be posted as a podcast on Live with the Eczema Doc. So on all podcast platforms. So definitely just follow my podcast and you'll see all these lives there as well. And it won't be posted on my account, but it will be posted on my story later today if you want to check it out. Okay. All right. So let's now talk about testing because, how do you figure out that you have a fungal issue? First off, working with practitioners who, are versed in this, who understand, that this could be an underlying part of the issue is very important because often you'll work with your pediatrician or your primary care doc and they're not asking any of these questions. They might be saying, oh, that looks like inflammation on the skin. Okay, let's just give you hydrocortisone or let's give you steroid cream, and not necessarily asking, why is this happening? Okay. And that's what we do at Clean Body. We want to uncover what is making the body toxic or dirty.
Yeah.
And then let's clean that all up. So let's identify what those things are. So Tori, tell us a little bit about testing. What can we do to confirm that there might be a fungal yeast problem?
Yeah, so the first thing that we probably do, I would say, with almost every single person is a comprehensive stool test. And this is just one way we can evaluate the microbiome. And so we're looking at, of course, the state of the microbiome, the bacteria levels, the good and bad bacteria, but also if yeast itself shows up. And what I would say is that these tests aren't perfect. They don't catch all of it. So, I think we have to take that in combination with, what we see on the skin and the symptoms that the person is experiencing and kind of put those things together. But we can actually see yeast grow in a stool culture where they actually culture the stool. We can see it also under a microscope, but it also can be a little bit like a needle in a haystack. Like if we don't catch it in that particular sample, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have yeast overgrowth. So that's something that is another reason you really need to work with somebody for that. Which brings us to the next test, which can be a good combination, is an organic acid test, because it's a different way that we can see mold and fungal exposure. We can see both. And it's actually a urine test, and it shows us metabolites in the system that can give us the clue that there's either mycotoxins or there's some fungal exposure. And so that can kind of help to make sure if there's anything missed on the stool test, that we're also looking at it from a second angle. So that can be helpful. And then also, once again, looking at pictures of the skin and seeing the skin and what it looks like along with symptoms. So that's a good start. We also have blood tests that we can look for. And to go back to mold that Dr. Fong was just talking about, you can actually have a mold allergy. So that's something that would make you more susceptible, of course, to mold being an issue for you, is if you're actually having an allergic response to it. And then some molds are just really toxic, like black molds, like stocky buttress. Those kinds of molds are going to be more toxic to everyone. So some of those serum antibody tests can give us a clue on just your body's reaction to whatever fungus, yeast, or mold is out there. So that's something to think about. And then there's other tests for the skin. You can actually skin scrape. And some people have had this done at like the dermatologist, where their dermatologist will actually scrape the skin and look at it and kind of see what is there and let us know. And then we also have mycotoxin testing, which is another type of urine test to see if there is any spores that have created toxins that mold releases stored in the body. And so we actually have ways that we can see that. And then, of course, your environment. You can always test. You can have a professional come in, but we also have a great company that we love called Immunolytics that you can actually test yourself. It's super easy. It's really affordable. It's a great starting place to just, hey, like I feel like I smell something musty in my bathroom. You can get a little petri dish from Immunolytics for next to nothing. You literally set them down, you close them back up, you ship them in, and they will send you a report of the spores that they find. So that's a great company as well to just get started on for yourself and your own house.
Yeah, and I think it's important too is, some people might say, "Oh, okay, now let me go and order all these tests and just run them myself and then I'll figure out if I have a fungal issue and then I'll just start treating myself with anti-candida, anti-malassezia stuff." Um but it can be hard to do that, especially to yourself, because first off, looking at these tests is hard to understand. What do I do with this information? And then treatment can be tricky sometimes, because we can have things like die off symptoms, which is where you start killing off bugs in your gut and you start to get all these symptoms like headaches and fatigue, and you could be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm getting worse, when really you could be just having die off symptoms and that's going to pass. And so it can be really important, because I know some of these are potentially available for people to just order out there. And I know my patients are ordering sometimes a mycotoxin panel directly online somewhere. But what do you do with information, I think, is the big
Yeah.
question. And then you can kind of get this information that feels super overwhelmed. Okay, so and we don't always need all of this testing. Is another thing we should say, is that sometimes we just need a stool test. Sometimes we do want to see, is there an allergic reaction to malassezia or mold, and that's why you're having so much inflammation. And then we have to kind of address that allergic reaction. Are there mycotoxins? And so we don't always test all of these either, okay,
Right.
because it can be quite costly to do that. Okay. So how do we then, let's say we figure out, okay, someone's, and this is really common, we might see a dysbiosis in the gut. We might see a yeast culture showing that there's yeast in the stool test. We might see on an oat test, we might see that there are, the products that are coming out are telling us, okay, there could be a yeast overgrowth in the
Mhm.
body. And let's see what else. We might find that there's an allergy to malassezia. So like an IgE to malassezia, and let's say maybe an IgE to like a mold. Okay. So then we are going to say, okay, well, let's hunt for mold in the house. And that's where Tori mentioned immunolytics, which is a test that we like, which you can download my new fungal guide. And you can do that by going on my Instagram, going to my last post, and just commenting fungus. And then we'll send you that fungal guide. And that will kind of give you the links to a lot of these things, like the immunolytics test, and certain topicals that we're going to talk about in a bit. Okay. So we might hunt for mold in your home. And immunolytics is kind of like that first line of mold testing. And then we might say, okay, yeah, there's mold there. Now we need to bring in a professional. We need to
Mhm.
figure out where it's at. We need to remediate it, because we can't just treat you because you might be being fed by that environmental mold, right? So we need to start by, okay, let's clean up the environment, because we can do everything under the sun, including nutrition, which is what I'm about to talk about next. But if you're living in a moldy place, we're not going to get very far.
No.
Okay.
Mhm.
So, Tori, what kind of food should we avoid? Should we
Yeah.
focus on when we have a fungal overgrowth or even a fungal exposure in our environment?
I think like the very biggest one, like if I were to like reduce to one, it would be sugar. And I would say that most people with yeast issues of any kind are craving it. So it that's a sign. Like if you are a person that's like always craving sugar, or like you feel like you have to have it, that can be a sign of that as well. But think of sugary things. So fruit juices, dried fruit, the sugar is concentrated, any even natural sweeteners. So that's going to include things like honey, maple syrup, coconut sugar. Usually, like when we are trying to make desserts like healthier, we'll tell you to swap cane sugar and use maple syrup, or use coconut sugar or maple sugar. And in this case, we don't want you having any of those. Highly processed carbohydrates. So white bread, like really refined pasta, a lot of grains, like overdoing the grains, and just a lot of starchy foods. And it doesn't mean all of them have to go. It's just being super cognizant of, and the severity of your fungal issue, I think can play into that. And I like to preface before going further just to say, like, it's not forever. It's therapeutic and temporary. And I think some people get caught up in that. Like, they do these elimination diets and then they think like that's what fixed them, and they stay on it forever and ever. And the second they eat like one bite of, a cake, it's like their skin goes crazy. It's because you never actually solved the problem. You're just removing what's feeding it. And so we need to actually remove what's feeding it, but also treat the issue. So this should just be therapeutic. Alcohol of any kind is going to be fermented, so that's going to have yeast. So wine and beer, especially, those are really going to be problematic. And then mold-prone foods. So there's foods out there that, typically get mold. Peanuts are, in the shell. A lot of those have mold on it. Blue cheese is actually a moldy cheese. There's mushrooms that are like that, aged meats, things like that. Anything with yeast. So there's a lot of, even food products that have yeast that can still be healthy foods. Nutritional yeast, for example, you will not want to put nutritional yeast on your meals if you have a fungal issue, because that's just going to feed that. Same thing with like kombucha, which I think a lot of people think is really good for my gut. I'm going to drink kombucha. And that's actually, a lot of them have sugar, and it's also a yeast. So you're actually feeding more of that yeast. So vinegar-based food. So think about even fermented foods in general. Probiotics can actually be really problematic. Not every strand of probiotics, but that's also why you would want to work with a practitioner, because some probiotics can actually be problematic in this situation. So those are all a lot to think about, but start looking at your diet if this is you, and just kind of what areas you're maybe partaking in some of these a little too often, and that can be a clue as well.
Yeah, this was a game changer for me when I had eczema. I grew up eating a ton of sugar and a ton of carbs, and I loved my white rice. And when I changed my diet and started to starve out these bugs by removing a lot of these sugars and carbs, the white carbs that I used to eat a lot, it was a game changer for my skin.
Mhm.
And I would get, the mapping around my armpit signifying like yeast growing here. That's a nice, sweaty, dark place that yeast loves to grow. And those pieces of my eczema started to clear up. My neck, behind my, like on my neck where my hairline is, that's where a lot of sweat happens too. And I had that mapping that we talked about earlier that cleared up when I took out the sugars and the carbs. And Tori's right, I only had to do that until my skin got better, until I fed my microbiome in the right way, and until I kind of killed off these bugs. And then, I went to kind of a more normalized diet, but still not really not eating any sugar or anything. And it's amazing to me because I used to have like soda and I wouldn't even think it was sweet. And now if I even have a sip of soda, I'm like, "Oh, this is so gross.
Yeah.
This is so sweet." Like I don't even know how I used to drink this.
Yeah.
Um and that's what happens. So if you're someone who like super craves sugar, you eat sugar all the time, it will change because you're not the only one craving these bugs. Your bugs, this sugar, the bugs in your
Yeah.
gut are craving the sugar. Their bugs in your gut are making you eat this sugar. And I used to be like hangry. Like if I did not eat, a meal, I would be so hangry. And that was not just me, that was the bugs. Someone's asking about fruit. Is fruit a part of this? So Tori, what would you say here?
I would say it really depends on the severity. I really don't like telling people to just like cut out fruit. Fruit's super nutritious. It has a lot of fiber. It has a lot of micronutrients. It has polyphenols, which we talk about all the time. Those are really gut healthy. So what I would say is it depends where you're at in your journey. It's another reason to work with somebody. But if you are like eating fruit all day, every day to like quell that sugar craving. Like if you say, oh, I'm going to quit eating sugar, but I'll just eat, fruit all day, that's probably not going to be super helpful. You can focus more on lower carb fruits. So think like berries, things like that, like green apples, as opposed to like more sugary fruits. But I would say most people can do okay with some fruits, but not fruit juice and not dried fruit. So those are very, very concentrated when it comes to sugar. And look at your relationship with fruit. Like I said, if you're doing it to fulfill a sweet craving, that is more of a sign that it could be problematic because, we want you to get rid of those sweet cravings, essentially. That's a good sign that things are getting better.
And someone's asking about sauerkraut.
Well, sauerkraut is fermented. So I would say at the beginning of your journey, you would not want to partake in that. And it's not that it's not gut healthy. It is. It's great for the gut, for a gut that is ready for it. But that is probably one, if you have a fungal issue, that you will feel pretty bloated after having it. And it can create some histamine responses as well. So I would hold off on trying to bring in those fermented foods until you're a little bit further along in the journey.
So, Tori, we're talking about foods that we should avoid, but
Mm-hmm.
food can be medicine. So, what can we emphasize in the diet that might be antifungal that may actually help our fungal issue?
Yeah, so garlic is a great one. As long as you don't, it's also high FODMAP. So some people have some FODMAP issues. So be careful and just pay attention how you react to it. But it's a natural antifungal food. So garlic is great if you do well with it. Same thing with coconut oil. I would say some people do great with coconut oil, but it's a good kind of fat that doesn't feed malassezia actually. So it's the MCT type oil in it, and it's got caprylic acid in it, which is antifungal. So that can be really great. Some people have a coconut sensitivity. So you have to take all of these things sort of with a grain of salt. Oregano is an fungal, antimicrobial. And then we have all of those like great herbs that are like anti-inflammatory, like turmeric and ginger, healthy fats like olive oil. Any kind of non-starchy veggie is great fiber that's going to feed the healthy bugs, which the more healthy, good quality probiotic bugs you have in your gut, you're like crowding out, it's like pushing the bad guys out of the room. And that's what we want to do, is create that there's no space for them. Those lower carb fruits, like we just briefly mentioned, berries, green apples, like lemon, lime, those kinds of things. And then there's a wide variety of spices and herbs that you can just add to your food. Cloves or cinnamon. Onion is another FODMAP, so be careful of that one if you have any, digestive response to that, like gas or bloating. But if you don't, that can be good as well. So that's just a few to get started. But we always push colors, rainbow plates, get those healthy proteins in, get those colors from different fruits and veggies, and start there. Build your plate around that veggie fiber content really to start.
Yeah, in my journey, I think it wasn't only the kind of starving out of the yeast, but it was the focusing on a lot of these really great anti-inflammatory foods, antifungal foods, and just getting a lot of vegetables on my plate because I had half my plate used to be white rice, being an Asian person, Filipino and Chinese. So, rice is really a staple of our diets.
Mhm.
And so, getting the rice off of my plate or making that brown rice or
Mhm.
changing that to vegetables was a big game changer for me, that I really felt in my gut and in my skin. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So when you are thinking topicals, you are gonna want to think, okay, if you're having that mapping, if you're having the hypopigmentation of your skin, like those lighter areas of your skin, and you're thinking, okay, there might be yeast here, you'll want to think about malassezia. And malassezia yeast feeds on fatty acids with chain lengths of 11 to 24 carbons. So we want to avoid anything that is an oil that's gonna have chain lengths in those departments. And Coconut oil is interesting because coconut oil has different parts to it. If you actually take out
Mhm.
MCT oil is okay, but we're going to want to avoid coconut oil just by itself. Olive oil, argan oil, avocado oil, jojoba oil, sweet almond oil, shea butter, cocoa butter, soybean, wheat germ, flaxseed, and linseed oil. And unfortunately, a lot of our eczema ointments and creams all have these ingredients. So if you find yourself putting some of these things on your skin and then you're just itchier, you're more inflamed, you're seeing things get worse, then you might be thinking, okay, I need to think about malassezia. But there are some oils that are actually safe for malassezia. So MCT oil is actually derived from coconut, but it's a medium chain triglyceride. So C8 through C10 is what we're wanting to think about here. And it also has caprylic acid, which is actually antifungal. There's mild fungal antifungal activity with MCT oil. So it's a good carrier, or even just buying it separately um, is a good idea. And then just putting it on the skin if you think that you have malassezia and you want to get some moisturizing on. Squalane is a hydrocarbon that yeast can't digest, and it's actually kind of matching what we have normally in our skin. So this is one that you can also use: dimethicone, silicones, jungle nut oil, hemp seed oil, sunflower seed oil, evening primrose oil. These are all possibilities. Probably my favorite is the MCT oil and the squalane as options. And you'll see a lot of products that might be out there for malassezia will have these two as the main oils that kind of give a little bit of moisture. Okay. Our top clean skin recommendations, again, if you download our fungal eczema guide, you will get all of these links and everything. But Clean Skin Calm is a hypochlorous acid. Hypochlorous acid has antimicrobial activity, first for Staph aureus, which is a bacteria that is important in eczema, but also these yeasts as well. And then we want to think about probiotics for the skin. So, Clean Skin Restore is a probiotic. So, not only do we want to think about killing off this yeast, but we want to think, okay, why is the yeast overgrowing? One, because the skin is leaky, the gut is leaky, but two, because the probiotics on our skin are probably not abundant. And if
Mhm.
we are eating a lot of sugar or we're taking antibiotics, it is going to affect the microbes on our skin as well. I like the citricidal cleanser and spray, which is using grapefruit seed extract, which I really like for malassezia. It is nice and gentle as well too. And then probiotic soap. So we want to think like kill and replenish. Kill and replenish is the way I like to think of it. And when we work with people, we will kind of figure out what the best option is for you because there's a lot of options out there. And so we'll kind of figure, we like to figure that out for people because not everything works, the first time around. And as I said, we have the Eczema Doc's Guide to Fungal Eczema. If you're interested in getting this, either just DM me or go to my last post on Instagram and comment fungus, and it will send it to you directly. Okay. All right. If you're interested in getting evaluated, Tori actually meets with everybody for eczema evaluations, which are initial evaluations. So we can just kind of understand what the root causes might be for you. The link is in my bio. You can click book evaluation. And right now, because it's Eczema Awareness Month, I am actually giving $50 off this evaluation. It's normally $97, but right now it's only $47. So if you're interested in just kind of understanding a little bit about where the root causes of your eczema might be coming from, definitely check that out and use the code AWARE that expires at the end of this month. And we do have a money back guarantee as well. So if you do that and you're like, that didn't help me at all, then you can ask for your money back and no questions asked. Okay. So we'd love to open it up to more questions now. And I'm going to go back because there were some questions that people were asking. And so I'm going to go back and we didn't answer all of those. Okay. So let's see. What about mold in the washing machine? How to
Mhm.
get it out? Oh, yeah, that's a really good one. So often for those front loading washers, we find that there is a mold problem.
Yep.
Top loading washers do better. I have a front loading washer, unfortunately, so I leave it open when I do my laundry. After it's done, I leave it open to let it air out. There is a company. Ooh, I think it's called Micro Balance. It's on if you go to cleanbody.health/products. These are our product recommendations. Under home and office, you'll see like anti-mold products that are natural, and they actually make something that's natural that you can put in your washing machine, and it will actually clean out the mold. So that's one option. And then you might want to just think about changing your washing machine if you have a front loading washer. There is a possibility, for that. Live with the Eczema Doc, my podcast, I did interview a mold specialist and he made some really great recommendations. So I recommend looking at that episode if you have questions there. And Tori, do you have anything else to add?
I was going to say the same thing. I used to have a front loader, and then we moved a couple of years ago and left the washer and we got a top loader just because it was easier. And we did the same thing. We would have to leave it open just to make sure, and I still do that now, even with my top, just to make sure it doesn't say like a bunch of moisture in there. But you'll see that they actually start to smell a little bit, even the front loader. So if you smell any mustiness, even if you don't see it, that's problematic. So make sure that you're checking and you're looking, get a flashlight. And that's super important because it is a prime place for mold. And
Yeah, and you're going
all
to
your
be
clothes.
wearing all this mold,
Yeah,
right? It's
right.
going to be all over your clothes. Yeah. Someone's asking, if you go looking for mold and tear down the house, most people will find mold, right?
Mhm.
If there is mold inside the house but not visible, would that be toxic to someone's immune system? So there's a high likelihood that almost every home has a little bit of mold,
Mhm.
especially in the basement or areas that are kind of dark and, allow that mold to grow. Your bathroom, if you don't have like a ventilator or a window and it's just kind of like the must just kind of stays in there, you may grow mold in there. So we could potentially find it. The problem is it airborne? Are there spores kind of floating around causing problems? So that's where the testing comes into play. We're either doing like a petri dish or an ERMI test where they're kind of like getting the dust from the floor and all that and seeing if it's kind of floating around. That's what we care about. Um in your home, and where is that a problem? You might find mold on the outside of your house, and that may not be problematic just because, if you're not being exposed to that. So it's really what's airborne, what are you breathing in, what are you being exposed to that we're going to care about. And that's what they're going to test when they
Yeah.
when they come to your home. They're going to check humidity and make sure that it's not super humid in your house so that you don't have an environment that's really conducive to helping the
Yeah.
mold grow.
I would also say, like you mentioned this already earlier, Dr. Fong, but genetically speaking, it's like, I can't remember, 25% of the population that has actually a genetic disposition to have a bigger issue with mold. So you may not know that about yourself, but you could be one of those people. That's 1 out of 4 people. So that little bit of mold will be more problematic for that person. It also depends on the type of mold. So, there are toxic molds like stocky buttress and other black molds are very toxic for everyone. And then it also depends how much it's growing. So if it's thriving and just growing and growing and growing, that's going to be a lot bigger problem than something that's a little bit more contained. So it's important to just investigate it because you're right. Like, we can't rid every place in the world of mold. And just depending on the state you live in or where in the country you are, there's going to be bigger problems in some areas as opposed to others. But, if you also have a mold allergy, that's going to be more problematic. So there's a lot of layers to mold for sure.
Someone's asking, would quinoa and millet be on the safe list to eat versus white rice?
Yeah, I would say yes. I would say once again, it's portion. So there should never really be like a plate where half of your plate is millet or quinoa, and then like a little portion of your plate is veggies. We'd want that the opposite. Mostly veggies, small portion of the grains. High fiber is good, but it also depends on where you are in your journey. Like, I would say we do sometimes have people that are severe enough that there could be a short window of time that we say, let's remove grains for a little while, just to give us a little time to bring that yeast level down and to get more nutrient foods back in, and give the body a break from all that inflammation. So it depends, but I do think it is within the realm of okay for some people for sure.
Someone saying my 1-year-old yanks his wiener very often. Doctors said that most likely he's irritated and just continued to use A&D. That has not helped. Are there others? And then it said another doctor said it's eczema and to apply cortisone in that area. We are not comfortable with that. Okay, so in this area, yeast loves to grow. Okay,
Yep.
this is a dark and moist area, and yeast does love to grow. So I wouldn't just start using anti-yeast products for a 1-year-old. I would make sure that someone's assessing this for you, and then recommending safe products, and then thinking about what is that 1-year-old eating. So we need think about that. Has the 1-year-old had antibiotics? Do we need to rebuild the microbiome? Do we need to do some gut testing to see what's going on in there? Is it just in that area, or is there other areas that you're seeing under the armpits, in the back of the neck? Does the 1-year-old have cradle cap?
Yeah.
Cradle cap is actually malassezia that's growing like crazy. Okay, which we forgot to mention, but cradle
Mhm.
cap is part of that. It's like a seborrheic dermatitis, but for babies. Okay, so we need to ask the right questions, and then we need to do some gentle things because we need to pay attention to that. This is a 1-year-old. Okay. My 8-year-old needs to see someone local. We've been working with a naturopath. Also went as far as flying to Chicago to visit well-rooted pediatrics. Okay, are you taking new patients? We've already got a lot tested. Okay, where are you? If you want to just if you're still here, if you want to just type, and then I can tell you if we can work with you and if you're local to us. Um, Even if you're not local to us, we do see people virtually as well.
Mhm.
All right. Is ozonated jojoba oil also not good? Okay. So if someone has malassezia, there's two parts to ozonated jojoba oil. Jojoba oil is not okay. The ozonated part is partially okay
Mhm.
because the ozonated part actually is antimicrobial. But I would say overall, it's probably not a good option if you think there's malassezia, just because that oil still could feed the malassezia. So I would just use a different option. Although jojoba oil ozonated is one of my favorites actually for eczema
Mhm.
that has to do with, like, let's say bacteria or like staph. It does work well, but I might not use it if we think it's yeast related. Okay, you are in the Bay Area. That's awesome. I am in the Bay Area, so I can see you locally in Menlo Park. So I'm in Menlo Park, and often we do a combination of in office and virtual, depending on like how often I need to see you. And Tori also sees people virtually, so it just kind of depends on what the picture looks like, whether the picture is very severe, whether it's mild to moderate, and we don't need to do as severe of even evaluation and treatment. So it just kind of depends, and that's where the eczema evaluation comes in. That's where we kind of decide all of that. And you'll be meeting with Tori, and Tori will kind of evaluate and say, okay, yep, you should be seeing Dr. Fong locally. And then the next person you'll meet is me after that. Okay. So again, that evaluation is $50 off right now. So using that code AWARE, and you can book that on my website at cleanbody.health, or just click the link in my bio and then use that code AWARE. Okay. All right. And then, is castor oil safe topically for eczema? I love castor oil for eczema. It's very, very sticky,
Mhm.
but I don't love it for malassezia. Okay, so malassezia, it will feed. So again, it's about identifying what is the root cause of your eczema. Not everyone has a yeast problem, although I will say there's a good majority of people that do, but not everyone has that yeast problem. So castor oil might be okay for those people. And often, if there's a lot of mapping, that flakiness, it just looks a little bit different. So that's where we want to take a look at what the eczema looks like. And then if you are reporting like, oh, I put these oils on and it gets more itchy and I get more irritated, then we might say, okay, let's not use castor oil. Let's use something else like MCT oil. Okay. Someone's asking, what about stinky feet? So, interestingly enough, when you do have any stink on your body, that's often a microbiome imbalance. And that can be related to both bacteria and yeast overgrowing in the body. And absolutely with stinky feet. I will have to say that when I had eczema, my feet were pretty stinky. And when my yeast was going crazy and like I had the eczema on my armpits, on the neck, I also had stinky feet. And so any stink on the body, BO as well, can be indicative of a microbiome imbalance. And so absolutely we'll want to think about all of that and yeast as well. Someone's asking, can they do a vinegar wash? Um, Now, sometimes a vinegar wash is just too harsh. It's not really the first place I would go for, especially if someone has eczema. Doing a vinegar wash might be very, very harsh on the system. I like to do, potentially like very low level hydrogen peroxide baths is one thing I like to do. And then using, like in the guide, citricidal cleanser, which is a grapefruit seed extract cleanser, which is very, very gentle. I like that one too. So, I like to kind of pick and choose based on who I'm dealing with. Am I dealing with like a 1-year-old? Am I dealing with a 10-year-old or a 60-year-old? So that it'll change what we're gonna do. How long usually for elimination diets, clean eating, no processed added sugar, etc.? And when do you start reintroducing foods? Tori, I'll let you take that one.
How long, I think, is individualized. So I would say at least a few months would be for most people. And how would we decide how long would be what's happening with your symptoms? So we want to be, once again, simultaneously treating the condition, not just eliminating food and doing nothing else. And then we know to bring back food when things are getting to a place where resilience is built, the skin is less reactive, you're having less flare-ups, like you're starting to see all of these positive things changing, and not just in the skin, but the gut, all the other organ systems. And that's giving us a clue that the body's probably ready to bring food back.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And we want to stress that like this is not a forever thing where we're going to
Mhm.
ask you to avoid all of these, sugary foods and carbs. I mean, we're going to want you to definitely not eat a lot of sugar just in your life moving forward.
Right. For
But
health.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, for health
Yeah.
reasons,
Right.
but where we have to be a little more severe, where maybe even some fruits need to be taken out, we usually stop that, when the body's doing really well. And that is different for everybody. And I think that we do often see people who have been trying to do this on their own and they're just like, okay, I can only eat 5 things.
Yeah.
Otherwise, my eczema triggers. And that's not healthy, right? We need
Mhm.
to get a varied diet. We need to get a lot of different nutrients. And so even though let's say and people have done this, they've come to my practice, they're like, I'm doing a carnivore diet. I'm only eating meat. I'm not eating any carbs or anything like that. And yes, maybe their eczema gets better for a short time, but then they end up getting constipated and then their eczema comes back with a vengeance. And they're like, I'm not sure why, because I was doing great on this diet. Well, that is not necessarily a healthy diet for you maybe
Yeah.
and it's not varied enough for you to get all the nutrients you need. And so it could have done a good job in the beginning because you're not feeding those bugs, but
Mhm.
now it's not good, right?
Yeah.
So we can't ever restrict the diet for a long period of time, and that's where working with someone can be really important because you might just be like, this is the diet I need to do for the rest of my life, and that's going to be unhealthy for you.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
It's established to avoid lotions when wet, oozy, and fungal. What about dryness? What's the recommendation for that? So like I said, there are oils that you can use if you want to kind of appease that dryness, that are going to be okay. So I would be okay with those. And then often that dryness is a good sign that maybe things are kind of healing, especially if the redness is coming down. So there is a type of treatment called no moisture treatment that when it's right, we might say, okay, it's better to not put moisture at all. Like just let it be dry, let it dry out. And then for some people, I might say, okay, use MCT oil or use squalane, use something to just help it to feel better so it doesn't feel so dry. Again, it's all on a case by case basis, and we have to analyze what is actually going on with you to really make that determination. If the dry skin is so uncomfortable, if it's a child, let's say, and the child is so uncomfortable, then we might want to give them something to kind of
Yeah.
bring some moisture. Okay. Someone's asking probiotics, Saccharomyces boulardii, okay for Candida. I'll let Tori take that one since that's partly nutrition.
I would say no. It's a yeast. So even though it's, a healthier yeast and, can be good for the microbiome, I would say as a general rule, if you have a yeast issue, feeding more yeast into that yeast is not a good idea. So I would stay away from it. And a lot of people come to us on it because they've researched or read about it or seen something about it, and you could be aggravating and making your situation worse. So be careful of those things.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining in and asking all your questions, and that's what we're here for, is to answer all those, cuz I know that eczema can be a difficult thing to navigate because
Yeah.
with your practitioner you may not be getting these questions answered, but I do want to remind you that all of this information is for educational purposes only. This is not medical advice. It's important to get evaluated individually, and if you want to do that, then definitely consider booking an evaluation with us. You will first meet with Tori. She will do the evaluation and kind of analyze what the root causes are. And right now, it's normally $97. It's only $47. So use the code AWARE if you're interested in that. And then we can kind of decide what's the best route for you depending on your budget, whether you have insurance, where you live, what your severity is, etc. There's options to work with Tori. There's options to work with me. So we kind of figure that out together with you. Okay. Thank you, Tori, so much for joining me today. And we're here every 2 weeks doing these lives, and then we put these on our podcast, Live with the Eczema Doc. So if you're not following my podcast yet, definitely start following it, because this entire live will be on that podcast next week. Okay. All right. Have a great week, everyone, and we will see you in 2 weeks.